The ranged combat style is probably one of the most difficult to learn in the game of RuneScape, but hopefully after watching this guide, you will be able to understand this combat style for what it really is. So without any further delay, let's go ahead and get into this guide. Now, the reason the ranged combat style is the most difficult to learn, I would say, compared to either melee, magic, or necromancy, is the fact that it is just essentially one giant knowledge check of a combat style. Putting together every little puzzle piece that range has to offer and putting it together to understand the big picture of how this style works is the difficult part. The execution itself isn't really that difficult because you're never really doing large input stacks or tick timing, so to speak. You are definitely operating just off of the normal global cooldowns. You're not really waiting ticks for anything. You might add in arrow swaps or understand what weapon spec to do next, but those inputs go together like combo eating food. So once you understand everything, you could think of this like playing the game of chess, where once you understand how all of the pieces move and how they work together to complete an objective, you can then start to see the beauty in what the game actually has to offer. So just like the last DPS guide, I think we're going to start off with ability selection. Now, in the last DPS guide I talked about a concept known as precision versus principles. And when we're talking about best in slot range, which is the perspective I'm going to be coming from in this DPS guide, as that's the version of range that I use all the time, and the principled approach definitely works with the ranged combat style. There are good abilities and there are bad abilities, but this combat style does require a bit more precision rather than the improv nature that magic has associated with it. But there's definitely a bit more precision required with the ranged combat style when considering how the Bow of the Last Guardian works, which I'll get into weapon specs and EoFs and arrows a little bit later on. But there are definitely good and bad abilities, so let's go ahead and go over which those are. For basic abilities, your bread and butter, absolute strongest basic ability you have is Gricko or Greater Ricochet, and it is by a country mile. When used with Corroming 4 on your weapon, it will put out 7 hits, and all of those will stack onto the target in front of you. The damage is pretty good, but having 7 hits go out at once when we're in the era of using crit buffing ultimates like Nami, Incendiary Shot, and Meteor Strike to gain adrenaline, this is a powerhouse when it comes to adrenaline gain and stack building for some of the arrows and other things that we have going on. After that, Corruption Shot is definitely a strong basic and is a worthwhile press, although in most Death Swiftness rotations you're not going to be pressing it a whole lot because you're going to be lining up stacks once again with Bulg, but it is a strong damaging basic nonetheless. Greater Dazing Shot is a pretty decent basic. It does decent damage and you can press it every 3 global cooldowns. Fragmentation Shot is also a relatively decent basic. You're not going to be using this in Death Swiftness too much, but outside of Death Swiftness, the nice thing about things like Corrupt Shot, Frag Shot is that used in combination with Split Soul, they are very nice to use there, or I should say the ECB spec, but I digress. Binding Shot is okay to press, but not really. You can think of this like Impact, where it's probably not worth to press too often, if at all, unless you need to bind something. It stuns for 1.2 seconds, but it binds a target for 9.6 seconds, so that is useful in some situations. Also in this kind of mid category of basic abilities, I'm putting Piercing Shot there because Piercing Shot is very nice for lining up certain abilities that you want to do later on because it fires 2 shots instead of 1. So for stack management, this is not a bad ability to use. However, it is one of those abilities where it is kind of weak on its own. So if you're using it a lot, which I have been a serial Piercing Shot spammer for a long time, it's one of the habits that I have that I still need to break. It's definitely not the strongest, but it has its uses. Now, one basic that used to be very strong, but with certain nerfs on, let's just say, feature-based mechanics, Snipe is a good ability. It's a strong ability, but I just never use it anymore, mostly because it takes 4 ticks to launch instead of the global cooldown. If ever we get some sort of upgrade for Snipe, I could see this ability coming right back into the meta. I would definitely put it on your main bar because there are maybe some like secondary targets you could use it for. It is a strong basic, it's just the hit timing is kind of annoying, and having to wait that extra tick over global cooldown is also pretty annoying. Now for thresholds, you have 3 main ones that you're going to be pressing, which is rapid fire, snapshot, and tendrils. Rapid fire in combination with the elite dracolich buff is very strong because if you channel the entire rapid, you then get a 6.6 second window where your crit chance is increased by 40%. So getting 2 rapid fires off inside of a death swiftness is absolutely ideal and pretty much mandatory to make these rotations work. You can think of rapid fire as a similar thing to Asphyx because they're both like the long channeled threshold in the combat style for say magic and ranged. Snapshot acts very much like wild magic does, as it is just a single button press, 2 hits come out and they're pretty solid damage. And shadow tendrils is a very strong threshold. The thing you have to consider when using shadow tendrils is it will actually chunk you for a decent amount of health while also dishing a lot of damage out to whatever target you are attacking. But if you are low HP and you're not paying attention, this ability can definitely give you a force teleport back to Death's office. Now there are 2 thresholds in general that are just bad button presses. Tight bindings is the deep impact of the ranged combat style, but that's not something that current range really plays with. Like no one's really buying flanking bulgs and aftershock bulgs and all that. Okay, well some people, like 5 of them, buy separate bulgs for perk swaps, but in general this isn't something that's really practiced. And overall you should only be using tight bindings if you need a longer stun. It binds for the same amount of time as binding shot does, so if you need something to be bound you can play with this ability, but in general I wouldn't be pressing it. And the threshold you should never be pressing under any circumstance is bombardment. It is a very weak AoE threshold, and yes, it can target up to 9 additional enemies, but if you're needing AoE with range, you're going to be using something like chins if you're doing some sort of slayer setup, and chins don't stack with bombardment at all. Or if you're doing a more focused AoE setup, you're going to bring out something like decimation inside of an EoF and go for that. And snipe with decimation active or snipe with chins is stronger than bombardment, and snipe gives you adrenaline, bombardment takes adrenaline. So hopefully people just stop pressing this ability entirely. Maybe it'll get updated at some point in the future because the animation is cool, but this is a DPS guide. We don't care too much about what the animations look like. So yeah, just fully ignore bombardment, keep it off of your bar, stay away from it. The last threshold you should definitely be avoiding is Salt the Wound, and how this ability works is you have to press greater dazing shot to get punctured stacks, and then this threshold takes the number of stacks to calculate an amount of damage out in a single hit, but it's really weak for the adren cost and again is never worthwhile. And for ultimate abilities, there are 2 main ones you're going to be pressing. The first one is pretty obvious, the greater death swiftness. This is the ranged version of Sunshine. It gives you a 38-second window in order to deal an increased amount of damage. It's 50% damage if we want to be specific, and this is the ability you're going to be centering all of your rotations around. It is definitely the strongest ultimate by far, but just behind it in terms of strength is Incendiary Shot. Now Incendiary Shot on its own is not a super strong ability, but the effect it provides is very strong. This ability works the same as Meteor Strike and Tsunami, where once the hit shows up on on the target. You have a 30-second window where any critical strike is going to give you 8% adrenaline for free. So while its damage isn't the most ideal, it's definitely strong for what it is. Like, it'll do a decent amount of damage on target. The effect is the main thing that we're looking for. And the threshold that is still good, but not nearly as much as it used to be, is dead shot. And effectively, this is an ultimate bleed. If you're using the Zuck cape, its adrenaline goes from 100% consumption to 60. And I pretty much use this ability in between death swiftness if I'm just staying on the range combat style. If I'm not doing anything hybrid, I'm just range camping. I'll use it in combination with ECB and the other two bleeds to get quite a good amount of damage out on target in between death swiftness. So it's not a bad ability, but it's definitely not as strong as the other two ultimates. And now that y'all have a rough understanding on what the good and not so good abilities are with ranged, I'm gonna move into the different special attacks that ranged uses and some of the different EoFs, and I will also be covering the main arrows. And well, the only physical special attack weapon you'll ever really be using with range is the Bow of the Last Guardian. Now, how this bow works is that every single hit splat that you do, so say piercing shot does 2 hit splats on that ability, so you get 2 perfect equilibrium stacks. Bleeds do not count on these stacks, it is just standard abilities. But once you build up to 8 stacks, essentially what the Bow of the Last Guardian is going to do is consume all of them at once, reset you to 0, and then whatever damage value came out from the hit splat that triggered it, it'll take a percentage of that hit and spew it out as an additional hit completely for free. So if ever you hear someone talk about like a triple dark bow, what they're referring to is dark bow usually has 2 large hits, but then if it procs on perfect equilibrium, it will give out a 3rd very large hit. It's not quite the same anymore. I believe on release, it literally just copy pasted the 3rd hit, but that was a bit too powerful when the hit cap was raised to 30k. This happened in like March of 2024. And so now there is just a formula associated with the perfect equilibrium proc. Now, I probably should have said this before, but that is the passive effect that Bow of the Last Guardian has going at all times. And again, this is why ranged is a more stringent combat style than something like magic or even melee, because those styles aren't worrying about stacks like this. And where the Bow of the Last Guardian really comes alive is when you activate its special attack, which puts out just a single hit of a large amount of damage, and it cuts the requirement for perfect equilibrium to proc in half. So instead of having to build all the way up to 8 stacks, it is now at 4 stacks. Now on screen here, there are quite a few EoFs. And that is the one thing about range is you don't really have any weapon swaps per se, you just have EoFs. You're going to be sitting on Bow of the Last Guardian the whole time, you're not going to be ring swapping, you're not really going to be doing anything, it is just EoFs and arrows. Now the 5 EoFs there are for ranged are the Zamorak Bow, the Gloomfire Bow, SGB or the Sarangad Bow, ECB or the Eldritch Crossbow, and the Dark Bow. The Dark Bow is a very strong double hit spec. It happens in 1 global cooldown, and I believe the 2 hits happen on tick 2. The Dark Bow is a very strong button press. This was the bread and butter and still kind of is in ranged rotations, but it does cost a lot of adrenaline. I believe it's 58%, and you'll pretty much be only using this under the rapid fire buff from the Elite Dracolich armor set, because you will want those crits in order to help out with its large adrenaline cost. The Zamorak Bow is essentially a scaled down dark bow. It does less damage, but it also costs less adrenaline. And this is one of the few kind of improv points with range where if your adrenaline is just not going the way it should be, which is rare, but does happen, Z-Bow is a nice replacement for a dark bow spec in the heat of the moment, just because it costs less adrenaline. It's still good damage for what it is, and it can help you get out out of some situations when adrenaline gain is just not cooperating. Gloomfire Bow is the most recent addition to ranged combat, and the big difference here is that it fires 3 hits instead of 2, which makes it kind of annoying to slot into ranged rotations, but it's not impossible. And the interesting thing about all the hits is they're not even. The first 2 hits are pretty mediocre, but the last hit smashes through brick walls like a semi-truck and is definitely worthwhile to prioritize, where that hit is the one that's proccing perfect equilibrium. Now, it is stronger than Dark Bow, but getting a 3-hit ability to line up nicely in range rotations that are either doing 2 hits or 4 hits or 8 hits is kind of annoying to get set up, but there is a spot later on that I will show you guys in the rotation where I have managed to patch it in, and it seems to be working just fine. Saren Godbow is a very strong EoF to use, but it fires 5 arrows out and they all land kind of around the target. But if the target is large enough, mainly if it's a 5x5 or larger, all 5 arrows are guaranteed to hit. Technically, you can get them to land all in a 3x3, but most people aren't really using SGB on 3x3 because the RNG isn't really worth it when you look at kind of the average damage. And only the first hit counts for perfect equilibrium stacks. The main place that I use this EoF is at something like Raksha, as it does a lot of damage in phase 3 when trying to get the pool skip, and on phase 4 when I'm trying to finish the kill. Other than that, I kind of just leave the SGB EoF in the bank. Probably the single strongest EoF that Ranged has to offer is the ECB EoF, because what it does is it takes any healing you would have gotten from Soul Split during its 15-second duration and immediately puts it back on whatever you are targeting in the form of damage. Honestly, this would probably be the first expensive EoF I would go for when kitting out ranged, especially if it's a boss where you're not going to take advantage of SGB, as this with a Dark Bow and a Z Bow can pump out an immense amount of damage. And with all of those weapon specs out of the way, it is time to talk about the thing that most people despise when talking about ranged, and this is probably the topic that keeps most people out of ever touching this combat style, and that is arrow selection. With ranged, there are 3 main arrow types that you're going to use, and the other arrows either have a niche application or are flat out useless. The 3 main arrow types you are going to be using in 90% of range applications are the Death Spore arrows, the Full arrows, and the Wen arrows. Death Spore arrows build stacks every time you crit while having them equipped, and at 5 stacks you will proc a 10-second window where you can then use any threshold, special attack, or ultimate ability, and the adrenaline cost is reduced to 0. A simple way to think about these arrows is to compare them to Insight Fear, because both essentially get used to reduce the adrenaline cost of a crit buffing ultimate. In Range's case, it's Incendiary Shot. With Insight Fear, it's Tsunami. But all you're really going to be doing with Death Spore arrows is building up 5 stacks, getting a free Incendiary Shot, or if the rotation wants you to get a free Death Swiftness instead, you follow the specific rotation, but that's all these really do. Full arrows are the most basic form of arrows. They are just a flat 15% damage buff. However, they do have an accuracy penalty, but there's no stacks, there's no frills, there's no specialty gimmicks. They are just a flat damage percentage increase. When arrows are a bit more complex, but to keep it simple instead of trying to confuse yourself reading the tooltip, the best way to think about these arrows is you're building up stacks every time you land a hit splat with them. Again, bleeds don't count with these, but Piercing Shot will give you 2, Gricko with Coroming will give you 7, and you can build up to 15 stacks. Then once you press a threshold or a weapon spec or incendiary shot, then when you press a threshold or a special attack like an EoF, where you trade in those stacks for a short window of time where you're doing a large increase in damage. And the way this works out is you get 2% damage per arrow. So in order to make these worthwhile over full arrows, you have to have at least 8 stacks, because that would be 16% damage. And with the more stacks, the more time you get with the buff. And the most practical place to put this when arrow proc is when you're using your rapid fire, because the timing works out to where if you're on 15 when stacks and you proc it with rapid fire, you'll pretty much have the buff for all of the rapid fire and the subsequent abilities that the rapid fire is buffing. And an interesting thing about these arrows is even if you're under the damage buff, you can immediately start building stacks again. So say inside of your little rapid fire window, you're using a Grico to help you build a Dren to use something else. You can build up 7 when arrow stacks during the time that the proc is active, but using any threshold while the buff is still active, it doesn't consume the arrows into a new buff and kind of stack buffs. It doesn't work like that. The when arrow proc has to fully deplete before it can be procced again. Now the rest of the arrows are either niche or absolutely useless. Blackstone arrows are essentially the stat warhammer of range. You apply stacks to a target and they last for 12 minutes. If I recall, it doesn't end up working out to be as strong, but they're like attacking armor rating or something. It's a bunch of numbers and math that I don't care about. These arrows just give you extra accuracy. Jas Dragonbane arrows are very strong as they give you 25% accuracy and 30% damage, but they only work on dragon targets. So if you plan on farming a bunch of ED2, then definitely bring these arrows along, or if you're doing something like Vorkath with range melee, then it is definitely worthwhile to bring there. But if you're not doing that content, then don't bother with them. Splintering arrows are in a void right now. They're not worthwhile working with or building the stacks for. Just completely ignore these arrows' existence. Jas Demonbane arrows act the same way as Dragonbane arrows, but their targets are even more limited because it's demon based. So if you want to run like the Zami dungeon with ranged, you could bring these along. Or if you're doing Zami and have to kill the demon on P7 slightly faster, I guess you could bring these, but overall they're hyper niche. Last but certainly not least, Bic arrows. They used to be very strong. They are not really used in a meta anymore. The quote-unquote poison build that Range had is pretty much a thing of the past. I don't think anyone's really doing it anymore. I will see some casual players teaming up at like Solak and all using Bic arrows to try and make the poison build work, but with how the Blood Reaver got nerfed and how the gem got nerfed, the like challenge gem from Morven where you were never at 100 HP, I don't see anyone seriously using these anymore, and honestly, if you skip on them, you're not missing out on anything. Now, I've mentioned it a few times. I don't quite remember if I went over it in a earlier recording. I do record these in kind of blocks, but if I didn't go over it before, I will go over it here. The Elite Dracolich armor set is the best in slot bow armor, and its benefits are definitely worth going over and explaining. Essentially, if you have at least 3 pieces worn, when you fully channel a rapid fire, you get a period of time in which your crit chance is increased by 40%, and whilst you're using rapid fire, each hit of it is giving you 0.5% adrenaline, which can also be affected by things like natty instinct, and then crits are also factored in and whatnot. And then each subsequent piece after 3 that you wear, you gain an additional 1.8 seconds in the window after rapid fire. Essentially, after your rapid fire, if you're wearing the full 5 piece, you get pretty much 4 abilities afterwards where you're on like cloud 9 levels of crit chance. Now, the last concept I need to cover here before I go into the rotations that I do for ranged is a concept known as wensporing. Now, wensporing gets a bad rap as like this super complicated thing that rangers do, as if it's like this mystical dark art that only the best of the best can do. No, it's actually really simple to wenspor something. In terms terms of just pressing the buttons, if you can combo eat food by rolling 2 inputs, meaning you quickly press 2 keys one after the other, then congratulations, you can wenspore. Now technically you can build death spore stacks from any other arrow. So like say you're caught on full arrow, you forgot to switch your quiver or something like that, you can use this technique to still get death spore stacks or chances at death spore stacks. Say coming from full arrows, or you still had your blackstone arrows on or something like that. The reason people call it wensporing is it's the most beneficial to do with wen arrows because you're getting 2 different types of stacks from a single hit splat. And the most common way to do this is by using greater ricochet on the tail end of a rapid fire buff from your elite dracolich. Alrighty, it is time for the rotation portion of this DPS guide. Now, if you skip to this portion of the video, that's fine, but there is some important information beforehand. So if you find anything that I'm talking about in this rotation confusing, it's probably in the previous portions of this video. Now, to start off any ranged rotation I do, I usually bring in a stalled tsunami. Again, with range being the most complex combat style, I would imagine most people out there are okay once they've decided to learn it to try some of these more advanced techniques. I have a whole video on ability stalling. Hopefully I remember to leave a card somewhere on screen. I think I called the video something like how ability stalling works, and it's called like hidden mechanics in RuneScape or something like that. But the too long didn't watch version of ability stalling is I'm here at the adrenaline crystal. I will then click this training dummy here and then press tsunami. I'm outside of attack range, so it didn't go off. That ability is now stalled. I'll keep my combat stance. I can use dive. I can use necromancy incantations. And then once I get to the target that I want to start attacking, I will then press the target cycle key and a spell, usually smoke cloud. So I'll hit target cycle smoke cloud, and then it will release the stalled ability that I did before. Now, what I would recommend is if you want to take these rotations to specific bosses, I would look for a specific boss rotation, because some different rotations are going to have you build a certain number of wen arrow stacks before stalling. Some of them are just going to start you off at 8, or you're going to bring a combat dummy and release on that. But what I'm going to show you guys is the actual stall and release that I use when I'm going with my friends to unmask it. It is probably the best analog I have for a general ranged rotation, because I build stacks and then I go with just a stalled tsunami, and then I start with everyone else. I don't get any special privilege by starting with a combat dummy pre-build. But that rotation would look something like this. I'll go ahead and grab my wen stacks with a Gricko into a greater dazing shot, put on my staff and stall a tsunami. Then I'm just going to run back up here for example's sake, but just pretend this is you running into a boss, maintaining your stall. And then I'm going to go ahead and release the tsunami into a death swiftness, hit a Gricko with my A-pot, ECB. If you need to limitless this rapid fire, go ahead, and then just let it fully channel out. Go ahead and hit a bulg spec into a snapshot, a dark bow, and then go ahead and wenspore this Gricko. Put on your full arrows for the tendrils, wen for the dazing shot, your death spore for the incendiary. Equip some full arrows and ECB spec, hit a dark bow spec, wen this Gricko, and then start another rapid fire. Dark bow spec, gloom fire spec, Gricko, and then another dark bow, and there you go. That is a pretty solid range rotation. I use that one at Amasket P1 specifically, and pretty much anywhere else. Now, that last rotation definitely was getting a bit wordy. Even I was struggling to try and call it out as I was doing it. So I'm going to do the same rotation over. However, I'm just going to have the arrow type somewhere on screen and only call out the abilities, so that way I'm not just speaking at Mach 5 trying to get everything out at once. Something else that is important is when you're doing the Gricko on this dummy, you want to make sure you don't let an auto attack fly out, because auto attacks do count as stacks for perfect equilibrium, and if you let an auto out, it's probably going to ruin the entire bulg stack optimization, or whatever the heck you want to call it. It's going to throw the rotation off, so just make sure when you click the dummy, you can click it from like the adrenaline crystal and then just press your Gricko, like stall it and let it release naturally. And in fact, that's what I'm going to do here just to show it off to y'all. So what you can do is attack this dummy and press Gricko, and then it's just going to release. You'll see the animation go out, press dazing shot, and then equip the staff. Go ahead and stall the tsunami, and then we'll run back up. And the rotation will look something like this. We'll release the Nami into DS. Go ahead and hit Gricko with our APOT, ECB, Limitless the rapid fire. Go ahead and hit Bulk Spec, Snapshot, Dark Bow, Wenspore this Gricko, then Tendrils, into a Dazing Shot, and then Incendiary. You get that for free. Go ahead and ECB spec again, hit a Dark Bow, and then a Gricko. Another Rapid Fire. Go ahead and Dark Bow, Gloomfire Bow, Gricko, and then another Dark Bow. And that is what a general purpose range rotation looks like from me. If I'm just going somewhere, that is quite literally my phase 1 Amasket rotation. And if you want to include SGB into that rotation, instead of the Dark Bow there at the end, the very last one that I did, you could use SGB in its place. I believe it works out just nicely with the Death Swiftness timer. I could be slightly wrong on that. Or if you want to use SGB and not bother with the Gloomfire Bow, the Raksha rotation still is a very strong Death Swift rotation. I did a video on it a while ago, and the method still works, even though it's not like the most ideal farming method now for bleeding edge, cutting edge rotations. And I believe what I do on that rotation is after the second rapid fire is fully done, what I would usually do there is then hit SGB EoF and then do like Snap Darkbow Gricko, so that way you're ending on very high adrenaline. Now in these rotations, I didn't use Zemi Bow at all. I guess you could, instead of using Snapshot, you could use Z-Bow twice. I didn't have to because I didn't really have any adren problems. And if you wanted to follow this up, say you were style camping with range and you wanted to do another Death Swift, all you would have to do is at some point before you press Death Swiftness again, just swap over to your staff that you have. It doesn't have to be an FSOA, it could literally be any staff. And then just use G-Conk before your Tsunami. If you want to go all out, you could even hit something like D-Breath to get a 4th Insight Fear stack. And Tsunami, if you press it like just a couple of seconds or maybe 10 seconds before DS comes off cooldown, it will still carry through. It still has enough of a time window to really carry through until you get to your Incendiary shot. If you want to play it safe, you can just wait a couple seconds before Death Swiftness comes off cooldown in order to press it, and your DS will be slightly late, but it's not the end of the world. But as you can see, range, once you understand all of the little pieces and how they come together to make a nice picture, it's not that bad of a combat style to do. There is a bit more to manage, and there is a bit more to keep your eye on, say in your buff bar. But again, once you're used to it and once you have learned it, it is one of the most invaluable combat styles to learn, being that range is the most difficult because of how many knowledge checks and how everything works together. If you can learn this combat style to its fullest, there really isn't much in game that you can't accomplish.